I never thought the sound of silence could be so deafening until it became the soundtrack of my own home. My name is Angela. I'm 55 years old, and I used to believe that being a mother meant you'd always have a place in your child's heart. I was wrong about so many things. The crash still echoes in my mind 3 days later. The sound of my vintage radio, my last connection to the woman I used to be, shattering against the hardwood floor like my heart had been doing slowly, piece by piece, for months. The metal fragments scattered across the room, and with them, the final notes of Nat King Cole's Unforgettable died into nothing. How ironic that the last song I'd ever hear on that radio would be about being unforgettable, when I'd become invisible in my own home. "Turn that noise off, you senile witch!" Those were the words my 17-year-old son Marcus screamed at me before he grabbed my radio and hurled it to its death. My radio. The one thing that still brought me joy in these endless gray days that had become my retirement. The one thing that reminded me I was still alive, still here, still human. If you're watching this and you understand what it feels like to become a stranger in your own home, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Also, comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. I spent 34 years as a librarian, surrounded by stories of people who overcame impossible odds, who found their voices when the world tried to silence them. I thought I knew about resilience. I thought I understood suffering, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the slow, methodical way my own child would strip away every piece of dignity I had left. It started small, the way these things always do. Eye rolls when I'd ask about his day. Sighs heavy enough to carry the weight of his embarrassment about having me as a mother. "Mom, you're being weird again," became his favorite phrase whenever I tried to connect with him, whenever I dared to exist in the same space he occupied. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when Marcus would curl up next to me on the couch, his small head resting against my shoulder while we listened to my old records together. He used to say my music was cool in a vintage way, and he'd ask me to tell him stories about the singers, about the era when love songs meant something deeper than the noise that passes for music today. I remember the evening I taught him to dance to "The Way You Look Tonight." He was 12 then, still young enough to let his mother guide his awkward feet across our living room floor. "One day you'll dance like this with someone special," I told him, and he actually smiled. Not the cruel, mocking smile I see now, but a real one, full of warmth and possibility. That boy is gone now, replaced by someone who looks at me like I'm a burden he can't wait to discard. Someone who flinches when I speak, as if my voice itself is offensive to his ears. Someone who acts like sharing oxygen with me is a personal affront to his existence. The change happened gradually after his father died 2 years ago. David had been our buffer, the translator between my gentle world and Marcus's increasingly hostile one. When cancer took David, it took more than just my husband. It took my last ally in this house that was supposed to be our sanctuary. David used to defend my music, my books, my quiet ways. "Your mother has excellent taste," he'd tell Marcus when the eye-rolling started. "You should listen more and judge less." But David's voice is gone now, leaving only the echo of Marcus's contempt and my own increasingly desperate attempts to matter. I've tried everything to bridge this growing chasm between us. I learned about his video games, even though the violence made my stomach turn. I attempted to understand his music, though it sounded like chaos wrapped in anger. I cooked his favorite meals, cleaned his room without being asked, gave him space when he needed it and presence when I thought he might want it. Nothing worked. Nothing I did was right. The radio had been my last refuge. Every morning at 7:30, I would sit in my chair by the window, David's old reading chair that still smells faintly of his cologne, and listen to the Golden Oldies station. For 2 precious hours, I could disappear into a world where love was celebrated, where voices were tender, where music told stories instead of screaming at you. Marcus hated it. He hated the volume, even though I kept it low. He hated the style, calling it ancient garbage from dead people. Most of all, he hated that it made me happy, as if my small moments of joy were personal attacks on his right to be miserable. I should have seen the explosion coming. The signs were all there. His increasingly aggressive complaints about that stupid old music, the way he'd slam doors when Billie Holiday's voice would drift through the house, the dark looks he'd give me when I'd unconsciously hum along to melodies that had sustained me through decades of life's ups and downs. But I never imagined he would destroy something that belonged to me. I never thought my own child would look at my one source of comfort and decide it needed to be eliminated. I never believed that the boy I carried in my womb, nursed through midnight fevers, and sacrificed my dreams to raise would become someone capable of such casual cruelty. The worst part wasn't the broken radio, though losing it felt like losing a limb. The worst part was seeing the satisfaction in his eyes afterward, the way he looked at the scattered pieces and nodded as if he'd accomplished something important. The worst part was realizing that my pain brought him pleasure, that my silence was exactly what he'd been working toward all along. I didn't cry that day. I couldn't. Tears felt too small for the magnitude of what had been taken from me. Instead, I knelt on the floor and carefully gathered every piece of my shattered radio, my shattered dignity, my shattered hope that things might somehow get better between us. As I held those broken fragments, something shifted inside me, not breaking, but hardening. Like metal being forged in fire, I felt myself changing into something different, something stronger. Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his young life. He thought he was silencing me. He had no idea he was about to awaken something he wasn't prepared to face. The morning after my radio died, I woke up to the sound of nothing. No gentle melodies to ease me into the day. No familiar voices of long-dead crooners to remind me that beauty still existed somewhere in this world. Just the hollow echo of my own breathing, in a house that felt more like a tomb with each passing day. Marcus was already gone when I shuffled to the kitchen, leaving behind only the evidence of his presence. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, cereal spilled across the counter, and a note scrawled in his careless handwriting that simply read, "Going to Jake's. Don't wait up." No please, no thank you, no acknowledgement that I might worry. Just a command disguised as information. I stood there in my robe, staring at that note, and felt something cold settle in my chest. When had my son stopped seeing me as a person worth basic courtesy? When had I become so insignificant that even common politeness was too much effort to waste on me? The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but oppressive. It pressed against my eardrums like water, making me dizzy with its weight. I found myself moving through the house like a ghost, my footsteps muffled by the carpet David and I had chosen together 15 years ago, back when we believed this place would always be filled with laughter and love. I tried to fill the quiet with small tasks. I washed Marcus's dishes, though he'd never thank me for it. I picked up his dirty clothes from the bathroom floor, though he'd just throw more down tomorrow. I made his bed, smoothing the sheets he'd kicked into tangles, knowing he'd probably not even notice. These tiny acts of service had once felt like love. Now, they felt like desperation. Mrs. Patterson from next door stopped by that afternoon, carrying a casserole and wearing the expression of someone who'd heard the shouting through our shared wall. She was one of those well-meaning neighbors who collected gossip like stamps, always eager to help, but equally eager to judge. "I brought you some tuna noodle casserole, dear," she said, though her eyes were already scanning the living room, probably looking for signs of the domestic drama she'd overheard. "I thought you might need some comfort food." I wanted to tell her that food couldn't fill the hole that had opened up inside me, that casseroles couldn't repair what had been broken. Instead, I smiled and thanked her, playing the role of the grateful neighbor because that's what David would have wanted me to do. "How's Marcus adjusting?" she asked, settling herself on my couch without invitation. Teenagers can be so difficult, especially after losing a parent. My sister's boy went through a rough patch too. There it was. The comparison, the gentle suggestion that Marcus's cruelty was normal, temporary, something all mothers endured and survived. Mrs. Patterson meant well, but her words felt like salt in an open wound. She was giving him excuses for behavior that had no excuse, normalizing treatment that was anything but normal. "He's finding his way," I managed, hating myself for protecting him even now. Why was I making excuses for someone who showed me no mercy? Why was I preserving his reputation when he was systematically destroying mine? Oh, they all do eventually, she assured me with the confidence of someone who'd raised 2 successful children and felt qualified to judge everyone else's parenting. Just be patient with him. Boys that age don't know how to process emotions properly. After she left, I sat alone with her casserole and her unsolicited advice, feeling more isolated than before. Even my neighbor, in her attempt to help, had managed to dismiss my pain and excuse Marcus's behavior. Was this how the world saw our situation? Was I just another over-emotional mother failing to understand her poor, grieving teenage son? That evening, Marcus came home with Jake in tow. A lanky boy with dead eyes and a habit of looking at me like I was something unpleasant stuck to his shoe. I'd never liked Jake, not because he was a bad kid exactly, but because something about him felt hollow, dangerous in a quiet way that reminded me of certain students I'd dealt with at the library, the ones who pulled wings off flies just to watch them struggle. "We're going to study upstairs," Marcus announced, though I could smell cigarettes on both of them and suspected their version of studying involved activities that would horrify their teachers. "Would you boys like some dinner?" I offered, hoping to extend an olive branch, to show Jake that our home could be welcoming despite whatever he'd heard about the crazy lady who lived here. Jake actually snorted, and looked at Marcus with amusement. "Dude, your mom's like a waitress. Does she always offer to serve you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just the insult, but the way Marcus laughed. A sharp, ugly sound that told me he'd been sharing stories about me, painting me as pathetic for his friends' entertainment. My attempts at kindness had become jokes between them, my maternal instincts twisted into something shameful. "She's always trying to do stuff for people," Marcus said, and there was something in his tone that made my blood run cold. It's kind of sad, really. Like she doesn't have anything else to do. They disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing in my kitchen with a pot of soup cooling on the stove and the devastating realization that my son was ashamed of me. Not just annoyed or frustrated, ashamed. He was embarrassed by my existence, by the fact that I cared about him, by the very qualities that had once made me a good mother. I poured the soup down the sink and watched it swirl away, thinking about how appropriate it was that my efforts should end up in the drain. Everything I did seemed to end up there. Unwanted, unwelcome, disposed of without thought. Later that night, I heard them talking through the thin walls. Their voices carried easily from Marcus's room to mine, and though I knew I shouldn't listen, I couldn't help myself. I needed to understand what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed so completely that my own child had turned against me. "Your mom's weird, man," Jake was saying. "Like, really weird. My mom says old ladies get crazy when their husbands die. Something about hormones or whatever." "Tell me about it," Marcus replied, and I could hear him moving around his room, probably showing off some possession that proved how cool and normal he was despite having such an embarrassing mother. "She's always trying to talk to me about feelings and stuff. It's gross. Gross." That's what my attempts at connection had become to him. Gross. The word echoed in my head as I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember when love had become something disgusting to my son. "You should put her in one of those homes," Jake suggested with the casual cruelty that only teenagers could manage. "My aunt did that with my grandma. Now she only has to visit on holidays." I held my breath, waiting for Marcus to defend me, to say something, anything, that suggested he still remembered I was his mother, not just an inconvenience to be managed. But the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of video game music starting up, and I realized that he was actually considering it. My 17-year-old son was considering putting me in a nursing home at 55, because I was inconvenient, because I loved him, because I existed. That night, I cried for the first time since David's funeral. Not the pretty tears of movies, but ugly, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal. I cried for the little boy who used to bring me dandelions and call them flowers. I cried for the mother I used to be, back when my love was wanted instead of endured. I cried for the future I'd imagined. Holidays with grandchildren, family dinners, growing old with grace and dignity. But mostly, I cried because I was starting to understand that the Marcus I'd raised and loved was gone. replaced by this stranger who saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to cherish. And somewhere between the tears and the dawn breaking through my bedroom windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being ashamed of who I was. I was done apologizing for existing. Marcus thought he'd broken me when he destroyed my radio. He thought he'd won. But he'd just awakened something in me that had been sleeping far too long. Something that wasn't going to quietly disappear just because it made him uncomfortable. Something that was about to remind him exactly who he was dealing with. I decided to try harder. God help me, after everything he'd done, after every cruel word and dismissive gesture, I still believed I could fix us. I still thought that if I just loved him enough, tried hard enough, sacrificed enough of myself, I could bring back the son who used to need me. It was pathetic, really. A 55-year-old woman begging for crumbs of affection from a teenager who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience. But hope dies hard in a mother's heart. And mine was still beating, still believing, still foolishly thinking that blood meant something more than shared DNA. I started small. I learned the names of his favorite video game characters, memorized the complex storylines he'd once tried to share with me back when he still believed I might understand. I researched his music, forcing myself to listen to songs that made my head ache and my soul weary, just so I could speak his language. I even bought ingredients for his favorite cookies, the ones with chocolate chips that I used to make when he was little and still thought I was magic. The first attempt at connection came on a Tuesday evening. Marcus was sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, completely absorbed in some violent fantasy where he could control everything and everyone bent to his will. I approached carefully, carrying a plate of warm cookies and wearing what I hoped was an encouraging smile. "I made your favorites," I said, setting the plate on the coffee table within easy reach. "The ones with extra chocolate chips, just how you like them." He didn't look up from his screen, didn't acknowledge the smell of vanilla and butter that filled the room, didn't even glance at the plate I'd arranged so carefully, with cookies still warm from the oven arranged in a perfect circle, the way he used to like when he was 7. "Marcus?" I tried again, my voice smaller now, uncertainty creeping in. "I thought you might be hungry." "I'm busy," he muttered, fingers flying over the controller buttons with practiced precision. On the screen, his character was shooting enemies with casual efficiency, their digital screams filling our living room with synthetic violence. I stood there for a full minute, watching him ignore not just me but the effort I'd put into something made specifically for him. The cookies grew cold on the plate. The kitchen still smelled like baking, and my son continued to act as if I didn't exist. "Maybe later?" I suggested weakly, hating the desperate note in my own voice. He finally looked at me then, and the expression on his face was worse than anger. It was pity, the kind of look you give to something broken that doesn't understand it's broken. "Mom, seriously, I'm 17, not 7. I don't need you to bake me cookies like I'm some little kid." The words stung more than they should have. There was nothing wrong with making cookies. There was nothing childish about showing love through small acts of kindness. But somehow, he'd made it sound foolish, pathetic, like evidence of my failure to understand who he'd become. I took the cookies back to the kitchen and threw them away, every single one. The garbage disposal ground them to nothing while I stood there wondering when caring had become such a shameful thing. The second attempt was worse. I'd overheard him complaining to Jake about needing new shoes. Expensive sneakers that all the kids were wearing. The kind that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I'd been saving money from my small pension, putting away $5 and $10 bills in an old coffee can, thinking I might eventually afford something special for myself. Maybe a new radio to replace the one he'd destroyed. Instead, I used that money to buy him the shoes. I presented them to him on a Saturday morning, still in their pristine box, wrapped in tissue paper like a gift. I'd even attached a small note, "For Marcus, with love from Mom." He opened the box with the enthusiasm of someone defusing a bomb. When he saw the shoes, the exact style he'd wanted, in the exact size and color, his face went through a series of expressions I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Confusion. And then something that looked almost like guilt before it hardened into familiar irritation. "Where did you get the money for these?" he asked, holding one shoe like it might bite him. "I've been saving," I said, proud of my planning, pleased that I'd been able to give him something he actually wanted. I heard you tell Jake you needed new shoes, so I thought, you heard me? His voice went sharp, dangerous. You were listening to my private conversations? The accusation hit me like a slap. I hadn't been spying. Our house was small, voices carried, and he'd been talking loud enough for the neighbors to hear. But suddenly, I was the villain for overhearing, the creepy mother who couldn't respect boundaries. I wasn't listening on purpose, I stammered. I just heard you mention, that's so weird, Mom. Like, really weird. Normal people don't eavesdrop on their kids' conversations and then buy them stuff based on what they hear. He made it sound sinister, predatory. My attempt at generosity became evidence of my inappropriate behavior. My gift transformed into something uncomfortable and unwanted. The shoes that had cost me 3 months of careful saving were suddenly tainted by the circumstances of their acquisition. I just wanted to do something nice for you, I said quietly, feeling the familiar shame creeping up my throat like bile. Well, don't, he snapped, shoving the shoes back in their box. It's creepy. And I can't wear these anyway. Everyone will want to know where I got them. And I can't exactly tell people my mom bought them with her spy money. Spy money. He'd turned my sacrifice into something dirty, my love into something shameful. I watched him shove the box under his bed, out of sight, and realized that nothing I could give him would ever be right. Not because the gift was wrong, but because it came from me. The third and final attempt broke something inside me that I don't think will ever heal properly. It was Marcus's 18th birthday, and I'd been planning for weeks. Not a big party, I knew better than that, but something meaningful. I'd found old photo albums, pictures of him as a baby, as a toddler, all the moments when he'd been mine completely, and I'd been enough for him. I'd written him a letter, telling him how proud I was of the man he was becoming, how much I loved watching him grow up, how grateful I was to be his mother. I'd also bought him something special with the last of my savings, a watch that had belonged to his grandfather, David's father, who'd died when Marcus was too young to remember him. It was silver, elegant, engraved with the family name, something to connect him to his heritage, to remind him that he came from people who loved him. I set everything up in the dining room while he was at school. The photo albums arranged on the table, the letter propped against a small cake I'd baked myself, the watch box positioned just so. I'd even bought a card, something funny but heartfelt, the kind we used to share when he still thought I was worth celebrating. When he came home and saw the display, his face went white, then red, then something beyond anger that I'd never seen before. "What is this?" he demanded, gesturing at the table like I'd arranged a crime scene. "It's your birthday," I said, confused by his reaction. I wanted to make it special. Special? His voice cracked on the word. "This is embarrassing. This is what you do for little kids, not adults. I'm 18, Mom. 18. And you've turned me into some kind of mommy's boy photo project." He started grabbing the albums, stacking them roughly, not caring that pictures were falling out and scattering across the floor. Baby photos, first steps, Christmas mornings, 18 years of memories treated like garbage to be cleared away. "Stop," I pleaded, reaching for the pictures. "Those are precious." "To who?" he shouted. And for the first time in months, he was looking directly at me, really seeing me. But what I saw in his eyes wasn't love or even anger. It was disgust. Pure, undiluted disgust. "To who, Mom? Because they're not precious to me. They're just proof of how pathetic you are, how you can't let go of the past, how you want to keep me as your little baby forever because you don't have anything else in your life." The words landed like physical blows, each one designed for maximum damage. He wasn't just rejecting my gift. He was rejecting our entire history together. Every moment I'd treasured. Every memory I'd held close during the dark days after David died. "I thought you might want to remember," I started, but he cut me off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Remember what? Being stuck with a mother who doesn't understand that I've outgrown her? Who thinks 18 years of suffocating me with attention means I owe her something?" He picked up the watch box then, the one thing I'd thought might mean something to him, and held it like it was contaminated. "And this? Granddad's watch? Really? You think giving me dead people's jewelry is going to make me want to stick around and play happy family with you? He opened the box, looked at the watch for a long moment, and then, with deliberate, calculated cruelty, dropped it on the floor and stepped on it. The crystal face cracked with a sound like my heart breaking. The delicate hands stopped moving. Time stopped. "There," he said, satisfied with the destruction. "Now maybe you'll understand. I don't want your memories. I don't want your gifts. I don't want your suffocating, desperate, pathetic love. I want you to leave me alone." He walked away then, leaving me kneeling on the floor surrounded by broken pictures and broken watch pieces and broken dreams. I gathered the fragments with shaking hands, trying to salvage something from the wreckage, but it was hopeless. Everything was ruined. Everything was lost. That night, sitting alone in the dark with the pieces of my father-in-law's watch in my lap, I finally understood what Marcus had been trying to tell me all along. He didn't just dislike me. He hated me, hated my existence, my presence, my stubborn refusal to disappear from his life. But as I sat there in the darkness, something else began to dawn on me, something Marcus hadn't counted on. I was done trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it. I was done sacrificing pieces of myself to feed his cruelty. I was done being ashamed of who I was. He wanted me to disappear? Fine. But when I re-emerged, it would be on my terms. As myself, with my dignity intact. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The days after Marcus's birthday blurred together like watercolors in the rain. I moved through our house like a sleepwalker, performing the basic functions of survival without really living. The broken watch sat on my dresser, its cracked face reflecting the overhead light in fractured patterns that somehow seemed appropriate for my fractured life. I stopped cooking elaborate meals. Why bother when he'd either ignore them or find fault with my efforts? I stopped cleaning his room, stopped doing his laundry, stopped pretending that my maternal instincts were welcome in a house where they'd become evidence of my failure to understand modern family dynamics. Instead, I found myself sitting in David's old chair for hours, staring out the window at a world that continued spinning despite my personal apocalypse. Mrs. Patterson would wave from her garden, probably wondering why I never seemed to go anywhere anymore. The mailman would nod politely when he caught sight of me through the glass, his smile fading when he saw the hollow expression I couldn't seem to shake. Marcus seemed almost relieved by my withdrawal. He moved through the house with new confidence, bringing Jake over whenever he pleased, eating whatever he wanted from the refrigerator, treating our shared space like a hotel where the staff had finally learned to stay invisible. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with what looked like satisfaction, as if my silence was exactly what he'd been working toward all along. The worst part wasn't his cruelty anymore. I'd almost gotten used to that, the way people adjust to chronic pain. The worst part was the emptiness that had taken up residence in my chest. A hollow ache that food couldn't fill and sleep couldn't ease. I'd spent 18 years defining myself as Marcus's mother, and now that he'd rejected that role so completely, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the birthday disaster, I found myself standing in our basement, surrounded by boxes of Christmas decorations and old furniture, and all the accumulated debris of a life lived in one place for too long. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just moving through the dusty space like a ghost visiting scenes from a life that no longer belonged to me. That's when I found David's letter. It was tucked inside an old shoebox, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful script he'd learned in Catholic school, precise and elegant in a way that modern cursive had forgotten how to be. The envelope was addressed to me in his neat capitals, "For my beautiful Angela, to be opened when you need it most." My hands shook as I tore it open, and David's voice seemed to fill the basement as I read his words. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're hurting in ways I can't protect you from anymore. I know you, Angela. I know you'll blame yourself for whatever's going wrong. I know you'll think you're not enough, not strong enough, not smart enough, not good enough, but you're wrong about all of that. You are the strongest person I've ever known. You raised our son with patience and grace while working full-time and taking care of a house and still finding energy to read me poetry on Sunday mornings. You turned our house into a home with nothing but love and determination, and the kind of quiet strength that holds families together. If Marcus is giving you trouble, and I suspect he will, because teenagers are experts at hurting the people who love them most, remember that his cruelty comes from fear, not truth. He's afraid of needing you, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of becoming a man in a world that tells boys they have to choose between strength and tenderness. Don't let him convince you that your love is worthless. Don't let anyone convince you that caring deeply is a weakness. The world needs people like you, Angela. People who still believe that kindness matters, that gentleness is a form of courage, that making someone else's life a little bit easier is a worthy way to spend your time. You are not too much. You are not too emotional. You are not too old or too set in your ways or too anything except exactly what this world needs more of. And if our son can't see that yet, if he's too young and too angry and too scared to appreciate what he has, that's his loss, not your failure. Be patient with him, but don't sacrifice yourself on the altar of his adolescence. You matter too, my love. Your dreams matter. Your happiness matters. Your voice matters. I love you more than all the music and all the radios in all the world. Never forget that someone once loved you that much, and always will. Forever yours, David P.S. Check the bottom of this box. I hid something there for you to find when you needed it most. I was crying before I finished reading, tears falling onto the paper and blurring some of David's careful words. But these weren't the hopeless tears I'd been shedding lately. These felt different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing dust from windows. At the bottom of the shoebox, wrapped in an old silk scarf I'd forgotten I owned, was a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside, nestled in velvet that had faded to the color of twilight, was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny radio with intricate details etched into the metal. A note was tucked beneath it, written in David's hand. For the woman who taught me that music isn't just sound, it's hope made audible. Play it loud, my darling. Play it proud. I fastened the bracelet around my wrist with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of David's love and the solid reality of silver against my skin. The little radio charm caught the basement light and threw it back like a promise, like a reminder of who I used to be before I let my son's anger convince me I was nothing. Sitting there in the dusty basement, surrounded by the archaeological layers of our family life, I felt something shift inside me, not breaking this time, but settling into place, like bones healing stronger than they were before. David was right about so many things. I had been strong once. I had been enough once. I could be both of those things again. Marcus's footsteps thundered overhead, probably heading to the kitchen to raid the refrigerator without acknowledgement or gratitude. In the past, I would have hurried upstairs to offer assistance, to make sure he had everything he needed, to transform his basic survival into another opportunity for connection he didn't want. Instead, I stayed in the basement with David's letter and his gift, and the growing realization that I'd been approaching this all wrong. I'd been trying to earn love from someone who'd decided I wasn't worth loving, begging for scraps of affection from someone who saw my devotion as weakness. But I wasn't weak. I was a woman who'd loved deeply and lost greatly, and still had enough strength left to love again. Not Marcus, who'd forfeited that privilege through his cruelty, but myself. I was a woman who'd spent 34 years helping people find the stories they needed, who'd created a home that two good men had been proud to live in, who'd raised a child through his difficult early years with patience and creativity and unwavering commitment. Marcus could reject all of that if he chose. He could pretend that my sacrifices meant nothing, that my love was worthless, that 18 years of devotion could be erased by teenage angst and deliberate cruelty. But his opinion didn't change the facts of who I was and what I'd accomplished. The basement felt different as I climbed the stairs, letter in hand, bracelet warm against my wrist. The house felt different too. Not like a prison anymore, but like a stage where the next act was about to begin. I could hear Marcus in the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors with his usual consideration for others. Let him slam them. Let him rage and stomp and throw his tantrums. Let him break things and shout insults and pretend that destroying me would somehow heal whatever was broken inside him. It didn't matter anymore what he did or said or thought about me. For the first time in months, I remembered something he'd forgotten, something his cruelty couldn't touch. I wasn't just Marcus's disappointing mother. I was Angela Morrison, and I used to be somebody worth knowing. I was about to be somebody worth knowing again. The change in me wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was quiet, deliberate, like water slowly carving new channels through stone. Marcus didn't notice at first, too absorbed in his own world of video games and casual cruelty to pay attention to the subtle shifts happening right under his nose. I started small. The next morning, instead of rushing to clean up his breakfast mess, I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table reading David's letter again, letting his words sink deeper into places that had forgotten how to hope. Marcus clattered around me, opening cabinets with unnecessary force, sighing loudly when he couldn't find his favorite cereal, clearly expecting me to jump up and solve his minor inconveniences. I stayed seated, bracelet warm against my wrist, and watched him navigate the basic requirements of feeding himself. It was fascinating, really, observing this nearly adult human who'd somehow never learned that kitchens came with cleaning supplies, that dishes didn't wash themselves, that someone had to maintain the domestic infrastructure he took for granted. "Mom," he said eventually, standing beside the sink with a bowl of soggy cereal, looking at the pile of dirty dishes like they were a complex mathematical equation. "This stuff needs to be cleaned." I looked up from my letter, meeting his eyes with a calmness that seemed to surprise him. "Yes, it does." He waited, clearly expecting me to leap into action, to transform his observation into my obligation. When I simply returned to my reading, something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the first hint of uncertainty about the natural order of things. "Well?" he prompted, gesturing at the sink with the imperious manner of someone accustomed to having his problems solved by others. "Well, what, Marcus? Are you going to do them?" I folded David's letter carefully, taking my time, letting the question hang in the air between us. Why would I do your dishes? The question seemed to genuinely confound him. In his worldview, my existence was apparently justified by my usefulness, my worth measured by my willingness to serve. The possibility that I might have other priorities, other claims on my time and energy, had never occurred to him. "Because that's what you do," he said finally, as if explaining basic physics to a particularly slow student. "No," I replied gently, standing to rinse my own coffee cup. "That's what I used to do. Things change." I left him standing there, mouth slightly open, staring at a sink full of dishes that would apparently remain dirty until he decided to address them himself. It was a small rebellion, barely noticeable to anyone watching from outside, but it felt seismic to me. The first time in months I'd chosen my comfort over his convenience. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since David died. I went shopping for myself. Not groceries for the household or supplies for Marcus's needs, but something purely selfish, purely mine. I drove to the mall, a place I'd avoided since retirement, intimidated by its noise and energy and crowds of people who seemed to know exactly what they wanted. I wandered through stores I'd forgotten existed, touching fabrics and trying on jewelry and remembering what it felt like to consider my own preferences. In a small music store tucked between larger retailers, I found what I was looking for. A compact radio, simple and elegant, with surprisingly rich sound quality despite its modest size. The young clerk who rang up my purchase had purple-streaked hair and kind eyes behind vintage glasses. "This is a great choice," she said, handling the radio with the reverence of someone who understood that music was medicine. "My grandmother has one just like it. She says it's the only thing that makes her feel human some days." I smiled, thinking about grandmothers and granddaughters and the invisible threads that connected women across generations. "I think your grandmother and I would get along well." "She'd like you," the girl agreed, wrapping my radio carefully in tissue paper. "She always says the best people are the ones who still believe music can save the world." When I got home, Marcus was exactly where I'd left him, sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, surrounded by the detritus of his afternoon. Empty soda cans, chip bags, the breakfast dishes still waiting patiently in the sink for someone else to address their existence. I carried my radio upstairs to my bedroom and set it on the dresser where my old one used to live. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and tuned it to the golden oldies station, letting Ella Fitzgerald's voice fill the space with honey and heartbreak. The music drifted downstairs, and within minutes, I heard Marcus's footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate, angry. He appeared in my doorway like an avenging angel, face flushed with righteous indignation. "Seriously?" he demanded, gesturing at the radio like it was evidence of a crime. "You bought another one? I thought we settled this." I looked at him calmly, Ella's voice providing a soundtrack to our confrontation. "We didn't settle anything, Marcus. You destroyed my property. That's not the same as reaching an agreement. You know I hate that music. You know it drives me crazy." "Then close your door," I suggested, turning the volume up slightly. "Or better yet, clean up your mess downstairs and go to Jake's house. I'm sure his mother would love to have you track mud through her clean kitchen." Something in my tone must have warned him that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd expected. His usual tactics, intimidation, guilt, righteous anger, were bouncing off me like rain off glass. For the first time in our recent battles, I wasn't backing down or apologizing or trying to find a compromise that would preserve his comfort at the expense of my dignity. "This is ridiculous," he said, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "You're being ridiculous." "I'm being myself," I corrected. "Perhaps that's what you find ridiculous." He stood there for another moment, clearly struggling with this new dynamic where his disapproval didn't automatically translate into my compliance. Finally, he turned and stomped back to his room, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows. I smiled and turned the volume up a little more. That evening, I called my brother Robert for the first time since David's funeral. We'd never been particularly close. He lived 3 states away and had always been more comfortable with David than with me, but something about David's letter had reminded me that family connections could be sources of strength rather than obligation. "Angela?" His voice carried surprise and something that might have been pleasure. "I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up?" We talked for over an hour, about everything and nothing. He told me about his retirement from the Postal Service, his new hobby of woodworking, the way his grandchildren were growing up too fast. I told him about the radio, about Marcus's behavior, about the strange liberation I was feeling as I stopped trying to earn approval from someone determined not to give it. "You know," Robert said thoughtfully, "I always admired how patient you were with that boy. Even when he was little, you had this way of seeing the best in him even when he was being a complete terror." "I thought that was what good mothers did," I admitted. "I thought if I just loved him enough, consistently enough, he'd eventually appreciate it." "Maybe he will," Robert said. "But maybe he needs to learn that love isn't unconditional acceptance of bad behavior. Maybe he needs to understand that treating people badly has consequences, even when those people are family." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet bedroom with Nat King Cole crooning softly from my new radio, thinking about consequences and choices, and the difference between loving someone and enabling them to hurt you. Marcus had spent months teaching me that my love was worthless, my presence unwelcome, my very existence an embarrassment he had to endure. He'd systematically dismantled my confidence, my joy, my sense of worth, expecting me to absorb his cruelty without complaint, because that's what mothers were supposed to do. But David's letter had reminded me of something important. I didn't have to accept treatment that diminished me. I didn't have to smile and nod while someone I'd sacrificed for treated me like I was disposable. I didn't have to shrink myself to make room for someone else's comfort. The woman in David's letter, the one he'd fallen in love with, the one he'd married, the one he'd trusted to raise his son, that woman wouldn't have tolerated what I'd been accepting. She would have demanded better. She would have insisted on respect. She would have remembered that dignity wasn't something you earned from others. It was something you claimed for yourself. I was going to find that woman again. I was going to remember who I used to be before I let a teenager convince me I was nothing. And if Marcus didn't like the woman I was becoming, well, that was a problem he'd created for himself. The music played on, filling my room with melodies that remembered when love was gentle and voices were kind. And the world still had room for people who believed in beauty. Tomorrow, I would continue this quiet revolution, this deliberate reclamation of myself. But tonight, I would just listen to my radio and remember what it felt like to matter. The next few days passed with the peculiar tension that comes when the fundamental rules of a relationship begin to shift. Marcus kept testing the boundaries I'd quietly established, like a prisoner checking for weak spots in a fence he'd grown accustomed to walking through at will. He left his dishes in the sink for 3 days, clearly expecting me to eventually cave and clean them out of frustration or embarrassment when they began to smell. Instead, I washed only my own plate and cup each meal, leaving his growing collection to fester until even he couldn't ignore the odor wafting from the kitchen. "This is gross, Mom," he announced on the 4th morning, standing beside the sink with his nose wrinkled in disgust. "We're going to get bugs." "Then you should probably address that," I replied without looking up from my newspaper. Another small pleasure I'd rediscovered, the luxury of reading with my morning coffee while soft jazz played from my radio upstairs. "But I don't know how to run the dishwasher." I folded my paper deliberately, meeting his gaze with the patience I used to reserve for particularly dense library patrons. "Marcus, you're 18 years old. You can operate complex video games, drive a car, and somehow manage to coordinate with Jake for all your social activities. I have confidence that you can figure out how to load dishes into a machine and press a button." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe? Or the dawning realization that the woman sitting across from him wasn't the same pushover who'd been absorbing his cruelty for months. But instead of backing down or apologizing, he doubled down on indignation. "Fine," he snapped, grabbing dishes with unnecessary force. "But when I break something because you couldn't be bothered to help, don't blame me." "I wouldn't dream of it," I said serenely, returning to my paper while he clattered around the kitchen like an angry poltergeist. 20 minutes later, I heard the dishwasher start, followed by Marcus stomping upstairs to his room. Through the ceiling, I could hear him on the phone with Jake, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. "I don't know what's wrong with her," he was saying, clearly assuming I couldn't hear or wouldn't mind being discussed like a malfunctioning appliance. "She's acting all weird and stubborn, like she won't do anything for me anymore." Jake's response was muffled, but Marcus's reply came through with crystal clarity. "No, it's not normal. She's supposed to take care of this stuff. That's literally what mothers do." I smiled, taking another sip of coffee while Billie Holiday's voice drifted down from upstairs, mixing with my son's complaints in a surreal domestic symphony. He still didn't understand that the problem wasn't my failure to perform expected services. It was his expectation that my existence should revolve around his convenience. That afternoon, I made another small but significant change. I moved David's recliner, the one I'd been sitting in for comfort during my darkest days, from its position facing the television to the window overlooking our backyard. Then I sat there with a book, enjoying the natural light and the view of the garden David and I had planted together years ago. The roses were blooming despite my recent neglect, their pink and yellow faces turned toward the sun with the kind of persistent optimism I was slowly remembering how to feel. I'd forgotten how peaceful it could be to sit in my own house without constantly monitoring Marcus's mood or anticipating his needs. When Marcus came downstairs around dinner time, he stopped short when he saw the rearranged furniture. "Why did you move Dad's chair?" he demanded, as if I'd committed some kind of sacrilege. "Because I wanted to sit by the window," I replied simply, not looking up from my book. "But it doesn't face the TV anymore. I'm not watching television." He stood there for a moment, clearly struggling with this concept. In his world, furniture existed to facilitate entertainment consumption, not to provide comfortable spaces for activities he didn't understand or value. "That's weird," he said finally. "Everything in this house is getting weird." I marked my place in the book and looked at him calmly. "No, Marcus. Everything in this house is getting normal. Perhaps that's what you find strange." Before he could respond, the doorbell rang. Marcus automatically turned toward me, clearly expecting me to answer it, but I remained seated with my book open. "Are you going to get that?" he asked when the bell rang again. "Are your legs broken?" The question seemed to genuinely shock him. For 18 years, I'd been the house's official door answerer, phone answerer, problem solver, and general coordinator of all domestic logistics. The possibility that these responsibilities might be shared rather than automatically assigned to me had apparently never crossed his mind. The doorbell rang a third time before he reluctantly went to answer it. I heard voices in the foyer. Marcus's sullen greeting and another voice that made me sit up straighter in my chair. "Is your mother home, son?" Robert. My brother had driven 3 states to see me without warning, and I felt a rush of something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation mixed with genuine pleasure. Someone had come to see me specifically, not to tolerate my presence or endure my existence, but because they actually wanted to spend time in my company. Marcus paused, probably trying to figure out how to explain that his mother was behaving strangely by sitting in furniture that didn't face the television. "She's in the living room." Robert appeared in the doorway, and I was struck by how much he looked like David around the eyes. The same kindness, the same intelligence, the same ability to see beyond surface appearances to the person underneath. "Hello, little sister," he said with a smile that lit up the room. "I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I was driving through on my way to a woodworking convention, and I thought it was time we caught up properly." I stood and hugged him, feeling tears threaten at the simple warmth of human contact that carried no expectations or conditions. When was the last time someone had touched me with genuine affection? When was the last time someone had been happy to see me? "I'm so glad you're here," I said, and meant it completely. Marcus hovered in the background, clearly uncomfortable with this disruption to our usual dysfunctional routine. He wasn't used to strangers witnessing our family dynamics, and something about Robert's presence seemed to make him nervous. "Marcus," Robert said warmly, extending his hand. "You've grown up since the funeral. How are you doing, son?" "Fine," Marcus mumbled, barely shaking Robert's offered hand before retreating toward the stairs. "Actually," Robert said before Marcus could escape, "I was hoping to catch up with both of you. It's been too long since I spent time with my family." The word family seemed to hang in the air with particular weight. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing that his behavior might not look quite as reasonable to an outside observer as it did in the echo chamber of our isolated household. "I have plans," Marcus said quickly. "I'm supposed to meet Jake." "Cancel them," I said quietly, my voice carrying a new note of authority that surprised all 3 of us. "Your uncle drove a long way to see us. The least you can do is stay for dinner." Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Something about Robert's presence, or maybe something about the way I'd spoken, calm but final, like someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than ignored, made him reconsider his usual pattern of automatic defiance. "Fine," he said sulkily, "but I can't stay long." As Marcus trudged upstairs to presumably cancel his plans, Robert turned to me with raised eyebrows. "Trouble in paradise?" he asked gently. I smiled, but it felt different than the forced smiles I'd been wearing for months. This one came from somewhere real, somewhere that hadn't been damaged by Marcus's cruelty. "Nothing I can't handle," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I actually believed it. Robert settled into the couch, looking around the living room with the observant eyes of someone who noticed details. His gaze lingered on my relocated chair, my book, the subtle but significant changes I'd made to reclaim my space. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "you look different, stronger, somehow." "I'm remembering some things I'd forgotten," I replied. "Good things, I hope. Essential things," I corrected. "Like the fact that respect isn't something you beg for. It's something you require." Robert nodded slowly, understanding passing between us like a shared secret. He'd come at exactly the right time, bringing with him the perspective of family that extended beyond the toxic bubble Marcus and I had been living in. Tonight, for the first time in months, I wouldn't be eating dinner alone or enduring Marcus's silent hostility without witness. Tonight, there would be someone at my table who remembered that I was worth listening to, worth treating with kindness, worth respect, and Marcus was going to learn what it looked like when someone actually valued my presence. The reckoning I'd been quietly preparing for was about to begin, and I was ready for it. Dinner should have been a simple affair, 3 people sharing a meal and conversation like normal families do. But the tension crackling around our dining room table was thick enough to cut with a knife, and I could see Robert beginning to sense that something was seriously wrong beneath the surface of our supposedly normal household. I'd prepared a roast with vegetables, nothing fancy but substantial enough to honor Robert's visit. The table was set properly for the first time in months, with cloth napkins and the good dishes that had been gathering dust since David's death. My radio played softly in the background, not loud enough to dominate conversation, but present enough to fill the awkward silences that kept stretching between Marcus's reluctant responses to his uncle's questions. "So tell me about school," Robert said, cutting his meat with the deliberate care of someone trying to keep conversation flowing despite one participant's obvious reluctance. "Are you planning on college? Following in your parents' footsteps?" Marcus shrugged, chewing slowly as if the act of eating was taking all his concentration. "I guess. Mom wants me to go to the state university, but it's expensive. Education is always a worthwhile investment," Robert replied diplomatically. "Your mother's right to encourage you. She understands the value of knowledge. 34 years as a librarian teaches you that." Another shrug. "Yeah, whatever." I watched Robert's eyebrows rise slightly at Marcus's dismissive tone, but he persevered with the gentle patience of someone accustomed to drawing shy children out of their shells. He had no idea that Marcus wasn't shy. He was contemptuous. "Your father was so proud of your mother's work," Robert continued, glancing at me with warmth. "He used to tell me about all the programs she developed, the way she helped people find exactly what they needed. He said she had a gift for understanding what people were really asking for, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves." I felt a flush of pleasure at the memory of David's pride, the way he'd bragged about my accomplishments to anyone who would listen. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about my career as something meaningful rather than just a job I'd held until retirement. "She was just a librarian," Marcus muttered, his voice carrying that familiar note of embarrassment that made my stomach clench. The words hung in the air like a slap. Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and he looked at Marcus with something approaching shock. In the sudden silence, my radio seemed to grow louder, Ella Fitzgerald's voice filling the space with a warmth that highlighted the coldness of my son's dismissal. "Just a librarian?" Robert repeated slowly, his voice carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with something that might have been anger. "Son, do you have any idea what your mother accomplished in her career?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably, probably sensing that he'd stepped into dangerous territory, but too committed to his usual patterns to back down. "I mean, it's not like she was a doctor or a lawyer or anything important." The casual cruelty in those words, spoken in front of a guest, over a meal I'd prepared specifically to honor Robert's visit, finally broke through the careful composure I'd been maintaining for days. But instead of the tears or desperate justifications Marcus had come to expect, I felt something cold and clear settle over me like armor. "Turn off that music," Marcus added suddenly, as if the conversation had reminded him of another grievance. "It's annoying." Robert looked between us, clearly trying to understand the dynamics at play. When I made no move to comply with Marcus's demand, he asked quietly, "Is there something wrong with your mother listening to music in her own home?" "It's old people music," Marcus said, as if that explained everything. "Nobody listens to that garbage anymore. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing to whom? Robert's voice had taken on an edge that made Marcus glance up from his plate with the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen all evening. "To normal people. To people who aren't stuck in the past." "I see." Robert set down his fork with deliberate precision. "And what exactly about your mother's taste in music embarrasses you so much that you feel entitled to control what she listens to in her own house?" Marcus's face flushed, but instead of backing down, he seemed to decide that honesty was his best defense. "Look, I know you don't live here, so you don't understand, but she's always doing weird stuff like this. Playing old music, trying to make me eat dinner with her, acting like we're some kind of happy family when Dad's been dead for 2 years. It's time for her to move on." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Robert stared at Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more dangerous. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but somehow more threatening than if he'd shouted. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your mother, who raised you for 18 years, who supported this family while building a respected career, who cared for your father through his illness and then grieved his loss, this woman embarrasses you because she enjoys music that reminds her of happier times? You don't know what it's been like. Marcus said defensively, but there was less conviction in his voice now. She's always trying to baby me, always wanting to talk about feelings and memories and stuff. It's suffocating. Suffocating, Robert repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Marcus, who cooks your meals? She does, but who cleans this house? She does, but that's not. Who pays the bills? Who maintains the car you drive? Who provides the roof over your head and the food on your plate? Marcus's jaw tightened. Look, just because she does that stuff doesn't mean I have to pretend to like her weird music and her constant need for attention. The words hit the air like a physical blow, and I saw Robert's face change completely. All pretense of polite family conversation evaporated, replaced by something that made Marcus shift nervously in his chair. Her constant need for attention, Robert said slowly, as if tasting each word. You mean like a mother wanting to connect with her son? Like a woman who's lost her husband wanting to maintain some relationship with the child she sacrificed everything to raise? It's not my fault Dad died, Marcus said, his voice rising with defensive anger. And it's not my job to make her feel better about it. You're absolutely right. Robert agreed, his calm tone somehow more devastating than shouting would have been. It's not your job to heal your mother's grief, but it is your job, as a human being, as her son, as someone who benefits from her continued care, to treat her with basic respect. I do respect her, Marcus protested weakly. Do you? Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something that made my blood turn to ice. Because I found this interesting item when I was looking for you earlier. It was hidden in your room, shoved under some clothes like you were ashamed of it. He held up an envelope, yellowed with age, with my name written across it in David's unmistakable handwriting. But this wasn't the letter I'd found in the basement. This was something else. Something Marcus had apparently been hiding from me. Want to explain to your mother why you've been keeping your father's letters from her? Robert asked quietly. The color drained from Marcus's face so quickly I thought he might faint. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and for the first time in months, he looked like the frightened boy he really was beneath all his anger and cruelty. I didn't, he stammered, but no coherent explanation emerged. There are 3 more letters in that shoebox under your bed, Robert continued relentlessly, all addressed to your mother, all hidden away where she'd never find them. Care to tell us how long you've been intercepting her mail? My hands began to shake as the full scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear. Not content with destroying my radio, dismissing my worth, and treating me like a servant, he'd been stealing letters from my dead husband. Letters that might have contained comfort, guidance, love during the darkest period of my life. Those weren't for her, Marcus said desperately, his usual arrogance crumbling under Robert's steady gaze. They were about me. Dad wrote them about how to handle me after he was gone. They were instructions for dealing with me, not love letters or whatever. That's not your decision to make, Robert said simply. Those letters were addressed to your mother. They belong to her, regardless of their contents. You had no right to hide them. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady, but my resolve crystallizing like ice. Marcus, I said quietly, go get the rest of those letters. Now. Mom, you don't understand. Now, I repeated, and something in my voice made him flinch. As Marcus reluctantly left the room, Robert reached across the table and took my hand. I'm sorry, he said softly. I should have come sooner. I should have checked on you both after David died. You couldn't have known, I replied, but my voice sounded strange to my own ears. Distant, controlled, like someone speaking from very far away. When Marcus returned with the remaining letters, his face was blotchy with tears, and something that might have been shame. He set them on the table like they were evidence of his crimes, which, in a way, they were. I was trying to protect you, he said weakly. Dad wrote about how difficult I'd be, how you shouldn't take it personally when I acted out. I didn't want you to read that. So instead, I said, my voice deadly calm, you decided to act out while hiding the one thing that might have helped me understand why. I picked up the letters with steady hands, feeling their weight like anchors to a life I'd been denied access to. David's words, David's wisdom, David's love, all stolen from me by a boy who thought he knew better than a dying man what his widow needed to survive. The reckoning had arrived at last, and I was ready for it. I read David's letters in the silence that had fallen over our dining room like a shroud. Each page revealed another piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 2 years. Why Marcus had become so hostile. Why he seemed to hate me with such intensity. Why every attempt I made to connect with him only pushed him further away. David had seen it coming. In his beautiful, careful handwriting, he'd explained everything. Marcus's fear of dependency, his terror of being seen as weak for needing his mother, his anger at the world for taking away his father and leaving him with what he perceived as the lesser parent. David had predicted the tantrums, the cruelty, the systematic dismantling of our relationship, but more than that, he'd given me a roadmap for surviving it. Angela, David had written in the first letter, dated just weeks before his death. Marcus is going to try to push you away because he's terrified of losing you too. He'll say terrible things, do terrible things, because in his mind, if he can make you stop loving him, then it won't hurt so much when you're gone. Don't let him succeed. Don't let his fear destroy what you've built together. The second letter contained practical advice about setting boundaries, about the difference between loving someone and enabling their worst impulses. The third was about forgiveness. Not the kind that excused bad behavior, but the kind that freed you from carrying someone else's anger as your own burden. The fourth letter, the one that made my hands shake as I read it, was about Marcus's college fund. I've set aside money for his education, David had written, but I want you to be the one who controls it. Not because I don't trust Marcus, but because he needs to learn that respect and responsibility go hand in hand. The money is in a separate account. The details are in the envelope marked for Angela's eyes only in my desk drawer. Use your judgment about when and how to help him, but remember that love without accountability isn't love at all. I looked up at Marcus, who had been standing frozen beside the table, watching me read the evidence of his deception. His face was wet with tears he was trying to hide, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked almost like the frightened little boy he'd once been. You knew about the college fund, I said quietly. You knew your father had left instructions about your education, and you kept that from me too. Marcus's mouth opened and closed without sound. Robert sat perfectly still, letting the weight of this final revelation settle over the room like dust after an explosion. I thought, Marcus started, then stopped, swallowing hard. I thought if you knew about the money, you'd use it to control me. Like, make me be the person you wanted me to be instead of who I am. And who are you, Marcus? I asked, standing slowly and moving to face him directly. Are you someone who steals from his mother? Someone who destroys other people's possessions when they annoy you? Someone who thinks basic human decency is optional if you're grieving? I'm angry, he exploded, the words bursting out of him like water from a broken dam. I'm angry all the time, and I don't know how to stop being angry, and everyone expects me to just get over it because it's been 2 years. But I can't get over it. Dad's gone and you're here, and I know that's not your fault, but I hate it anyway. The honesty in his voice was like a knife cutting through months of pretense and cruelty. For the first time since David's death, I was hearing my son's real voice instead of the bitter stranger who'd been living in our house. I hate that you try so hard, he continued, tears streaming down his face now without shame. I hate that you keep being nice to me when I'm horrible to you. I hate that you make dinner and clean the house and act like everything's normal when nothing will ever be normal again. I hate that you love Dad more than you'll ever love me, and I hate that I can't be him, and I hate that you're stuck with me instead. The words hung in the air between us, raw and painful, and finally true. This was what I'd been trying to reach for months. Not his anger, but the hurt underneath it. Not his cruelty, but the fear that drove it. I stepped closer to him, close enough to see the child he still was beneath all his adult-sized rage. Marcus, I said gently, you're not a consolation prize. You're not a poor substitute for your father. You're my son, and I've loved you since before you took your first breath. That will never change, no matter how hard you try to make it change. But I broke your radio, he whispered. I said terrible things. I hid Dad's letters from you. Yes, you did, I agreed. And those were choices you made, cruel choices that hurt me deeply. But they don't change the fact that you're my child, and I love you. I don't know how to stop being angry, he said, his voice breaking on the words. You don't have to stop being angry, I replied. Anger is part of grief, and grief is love with nowhere to go. But you do have to stop using your anger as an excuse to hurt people who care about you. Robert cleared his throat gently. Marcus, he said, his voice kind but firm, your mother has been grieving too. She lost her husband, her best friend, her partner in raising you. But she didn't use her grief as permission to treat you badly. She kept loving you, kept caring for you, kept trying to be what you needed even when you made it clear that nothing she did would ever be enough. Marcus looked between us, his face crumpled with the weight of understanding what he'd done, what he'd almost destroyed through his deliberate cruelty. I don't know how to fix this, he said helplessly. You start, I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out the small radio bracelet David had left for me. By understanding that some things can't be fixed, they can only be rebuilt. You destroyed my radio, but you can't give me back those months of peace you stole from me. You hid your father's letters, but you can't undo the pain I felt when I thought he'd left me nothing but silence. I fastened the bracelet around my wrist, feeling its weight like a promise, like armor. But you can choose to be different from this moment forward, I continued. You can choose to treat me like a person who deserves respect. You can choose to honor your father's memory by becoming the kind of man he hoped you'd be. You can choose to be worthy of the love you've been given. Marcus stared at the bracelet, recognition dawning in his eyes. That's a radio. It's hope, I corrected. It's a reminder that music can't be silenced, that beauty persists even when people try to destroy it, that love finds a way to survive even the worst we can do to each other. I walked to the window and adjusted the volume on my radio, letting Nat King Cole's voice fill the room with Unforgettable, the same song that had been playing when Marcus destroyed my old radio, now playing again as I reclaimed my right to joy. This is who I am, I said, turning back to face both Marcus and Robert. I'm a woman who believes in the power of music, who thinks kindness matters more than coolness, who knows that love is something you do, not something you feel. I'm a librarian who spent 34 years helping people find what they needed, a wife who loved a good man completely, a mother who raised a son through the hardest years of his life. I looked directly at Marcus, my voice steady and sure. I'm not old-fashioned or embarrassing or suffocating. I'm not too emotional or too needy or too anything except exactly who I've always been. And if you can't appreciate that, if you can't treat me with the respect I deserve, then you'll need to find somewhere else to live when you turn 18 next month. Because I'm done shrinking myself to make room for your anger. Marcus's eyes widened. You'd kick me out? I'd require you to grow up, I corrected. Your father left you money for college, money I control according to his wishes. He wanted you to learn that choices have consequences, that respect must be earned, that love without accountability isn't love at all. I pulled out the bank information David had hidden in his desk, setting it on the table where Marcus could see it. This is your inheritance, I said. Enough for 4 years of education, enough for a fresh start, enough to build whatever life you want for yourself. But it comes with conditions that your father set and I will enforce. You treat the people who love you with respect, you take responsibility for your choices, and you become someone worthy of the sacrifices that have been made for you. Marcus looked at the papers, then at me, then at Robert, who nodded encouragingly. I want to try, Marcus said quietly. I want to be better than I've been. Then start now, I said simply. Apologize for what you've done, mean it when you say it, and show me through your actions that you're serious about change. Marcus took a shaky breath, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, and for the first time in 2 years, his voice carried no sarcasm, no resentment, no hidden cruelty. I'm sorry I broke your radio. I'm sorry I hid Dad's letters. I'm sorry I've been such a terrible son. I'm sorry I tried to make you pay for Dad being gone when none of it was your fault. I felt tears starting in my own eyes, but they were different tears. Not the hopeless sobs of the past months, but the cleansing rain that comes after storms, washing the air clean and making space for new growth. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you know. Robert smiled, standing to clear the table as if this was the most natural thing in the world, as if families worked through their deepest wounds over dinner every day. "I think," he said gently, "this might be a good time for me to share some stories about your father when he was your age. He wasn't always the perfect man you remember, Marcus. He had to learn how to be worthy of your mother's love, too." As the evening settled around us, my radio playing softly in the background, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the fragile quiet of surrender, but the deep stillness that comes when justice has been served, and truth has been spoken, and love has proven stronger than the worst we can do to each other. Marcus was 18 now, old enough to choose who he wanted to become. I'd given him the tools: his father's wisdom, my forgiveness, the resources to build a better life. What he did with them would be up to him. But for the first time since David died, I wasn't afraid of the answer. I was Angela Morrison, and I had remembered who I was.